Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to the latest session in the Protect Association webinar series. Thank you for hanging on for a few moments while we got started. So I'm James Evans, I lead the Protect Association while working across the financial services sector in consumer duty, customer experience and vulnerability strategy. Great to have such a strong interest in today's topic. So vulnerability remains one of the most pressing and complex areas for regulated firms, particularly within insurance. And today we're asking a very direct question. Are 50% of your customers really vulnerable? And if so, how do you manage to treat them? Obviously, the 50% is a number that I think a lot of organisations see as quite daunting and almost far too far away from the numbers that they are sitting at currently, and therefore may well dismiss that number. But hopefully, will come some way to explain where the number comes from and how to work towards being able to treat all customers that are experiencing such circumstances and able to identify them as well. So it's a fairly sensational number, but it does reflect the reality that many firms are beginning to face and raises serious questions about how to identify, support and act on vulnerability within our organisations. Before I go any further, I want to thank our sponsor Voice for sponsoring this session and for their continued support through 2025. VoIC, as we're going to understand on this call today as well through Simran, help firms track customer outcomes through AI-powered call monitoring, quality assurance, supporting consumer duty requirements in a highly practical and scalable way. And as I say, we're going to hear a little bit more about that later on, including a great and recent case study. At this moment, I'd also like to acknowledge the brilliant piece of work that's been done recently and shared by Chris Fitch at the Money Advice Trust, titled The Golden Thread. So you may hear us refer back to these themes through today's session, but as I say, well worth a read on its own, and we'll begin to help you understand customer vulnerability at a far greater level of depth. So I'm delighted to be joined by two highly respected speakers today. Firstly, Simran Gill, who is a strategic account executive for the UK insurance sector at Voice, and Helen Lord, who is the CEO of the Vulnerability Registration Service. Before we get into the substance, it'd be great to introduce you both briefly and ask you to share a little bit about what you do. So, Helen, over to you first.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Helen Lord. I'm the CEO of the Vulnerability Registration Service. We set up 9 years ago to try and provide vulnerable individuals with a single voice to help them identify when they are in vulnerable circumstances, and they do that by sharing data through us, which can be accessed by any of their service providers, giving those firms a heads up to the fact that somebody's in a difficult situation. So we've gradually grown. We've got a growing database, and we've expanded the functionality of that database to allow individuals to express the types of support they're looking for when they've identified themselves as vulnerable too.
Excellent, thank you, Helen. And Simran?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Simran. I work closely with new businesses looking to implement Voice and showing them the value of what we can bring to them by monitoring 100% of all customer calls, automating the QA process, and ultimately treating customers with consistency and care.
Super, thank you, Simran. Okay, so as I said, we're going to dive straight in and ask some fairly difficult questions, which is ultimately, is 50% a real number here? So Helen, I'll start with you. So that's the headline figure, 50% is talked about widely. From your perspective at the Vulnerability Registration Service, does this stand up to scrutiny, do you think? And what does your data and experience show?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's good news and bad news associated with that figure. I think the bad news is, yes, it probably is true. I think half of us are vulnerable at any given time, and you only need to look at stats and figures and start to tot them up. You're talking, 2040, 1.2 million people with Alzheimer's. You're talking 5.8 million of us are unpaid carers, and all of those people covering off unpaid care or caring for another person. It doesn't take a lot to start to realise that if you throw in people in financial distress and difficulty, people struggling with mental health, that yes, there are a lot of us that are vulnerable, and it could be any of us at any given time. We're all going to get old. We're all going to experience bereavement at some point in our lives. We're probably going to have to care for somebody, and unless we're very lucky, we're going to have money difficulties at some point. So it is changeable, and I think that's why we struggle to grasp hold of it. We're dealing with human beings who are impacted in different ways, and we're very often trying to apply corporate rules and try to manage those things in a corporate way, and it's difficult. I think the good news is when you break it down, just because somebody has identified the fact that they're vulnerable, it doesn't mean you have to assign a caseworker or some sort of counsellor to all of those individuals. Sometimes that vulnerability is not relevant to their dealings with you. You might need to be aware of it. It's good to have it flagged up. But I think if we look in the insurance world, certain circumstances don't mean that somebody shouldn't be applying for insurance or it changes that customer journey in any way. It might have an impact if they need to make a claim. It might have an impact in the ways they need to communicate with you. And I think what we need to do is perhaps rethink and re-engineer some of our customer journeys to make sure we're not putting all of those 50% of us, if you like, in the same pot and managing it in the same way. And I think we also need to understand, we see that when somebody registers with us, they're identifying about 6.7 different facets of vulnerability. That could be mental health, it could be a life event, it can be financial difficulty. So it's not that simple. And I think it's getting the context, understanding what the causes of somebody's problem when they're dealing with you is, and the way you deal with them, what the effect of that's going to be.
Yeah.
It is difficult, but I think the figures are real, but I think the challenge isn't we have got to respond to 50% of our customers as vulnerable.
Sure. And in terms of your personal experience, what you've seen in the last few years since the Vulnerability Registration Service has been around, do you think that the conversation is successfully shifting from a binary view of vulnerability, whereby someone has to have a fairly obvious problem, such as issues with their site, to actually understanding that there's much more nuance to people's situations and that people can slip in and out of vulnerability and that it's life events? And so you almost begin to go from 50% feeling unrealistic to actually you can begin to see how 50% adds up. Do you think that the industry has moved on in terms of its view of that?
Yeah, and I think that probably mirrors society as a whole. We've got a recognition for it and an acknowledgement for it, and certainly when we see guidance coming out from regulators like the FCA, they are highlighting the fact that we need to deal with multifaceted aspects of vulnerability and multiple characteristics. Whether we have got a sufficient handle on that and we're addressing it in the right way yet is a different question, and it is a learning curve, I think, for all of us in whatever sector we're working in.
Yeah, and I've seen some brilliant examples and some fairly poor examples as well. So those brilliant examples wouldn't be around unless it had moved on somewhat, but there's certainly some ground to cover. Simran, from your conversations with firms and the insight you're gathering through Voice, how are businesses reacting to this 50% figure? Are you seeing that they believe it? And more importantly, I suppose, are they equipped to deal with it?
I'd say they don't believe it, and that's simply due to a lack of education and on what a vulnerability is. I agree that definitely times are changing, and as a society, we're becoming more aware of that. But I'd say at the moment, yeah, potentially they don't believe it, and equally, they're not equipped to deal with it because the same is true for agents. On the phones, they're not therapists; they can't be expected to recognize every single vulnerability, unfortunately. I'll give you an example. A broker I was working with up north, they specialised in landlord and tenant insurance, and I took a sample of their own calls and I ran them through Voice to demonstrate Voice on their own calls to see if there was anything missing. And interestingly, we picked up an agent ask if there was anything they should be aware of, and the customer said, "Well, I do have ADHD, if that's what you mean." And the agent said, no, I don't mean anything like that. I mean, have you got any disabilities? So actually, the agent had clearly missed this potential vulnerability. And we fed that back to them, and through Voice, we help uncover thousands of vulnerable customers every week. Maybe 90% of the time they might have missed. So firms are now recognising the scale of this and how they can better support their customers, really.
Sure. And I suppose it poses an issue to firms, because if you're being cynical, working inside a commercial organisation such as an insurer, you're going to say, well, I don't necessarily want to identify 50% of my customers as vulnerable, because that then means I have to adjust service for 50%. But the point is, if you can automate something like the detection and indeed how it is recommended you are offering treatment to people with certain vulnerabilities, then you're able to systemize that and take away the burden that becomes needing to treat everyone with a vulnerability as an individual case that requires individual consideration, going up to individual steering groups, etc., to begin to get certain treatments signed off, etc. So I think really that the automation of the detection and of the recommendation as to what is next best step for that customer, I think is absolutely key.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Having that kind of workflow in place to be able to act on that, but in an automated fashion, absolutely.
Sure. Excellent. So identifying vulnerability in practice, we touched a little bit on this. Helen, one of the most frequent questions I hear is around identification. So firms want to help, but worry about stereotyping, getting it wrong, having insensitive conversations. What does effective and appropriate identification look like in practice, do you think?
Okay, and again, it isn't that simple. I mean, obviously, if an individual is voicing the fact that they're vulnerable, we need to recognise that, we need to act upon that, and if appropriate, record that. But also, I think we have to acknowledge that somebody, say on a customer service call, is not necessarily going to disclose all aspects of their vulnerability. There may not be time, they may be uncomfortable about doing it, they're talking to a human being. So there has to be other ways of identifying it. But if somebody's told you, then you need to do it. I think also if it's essential that where there are tools out there to help you to identify vulnerability, those are used. There's no mandate out there at the moment to say you've got to do that, but there is an expectation that you use what's available to do that. And I mean, you've got two examples of it sitting here. You and Simran will talk about all the clever AI stuff around it. But I mean, we have a database of vulnerable people. You know, any organisation can access that information and identify vulnerability. And as I said, you know, we're getting people telling us 6.7 different characteristics of vulnerability, and it might be as simple as I'm in financial difficulty, but it might be more complicated in terms of I've got a gaming addiction, I've got a drug addiction, I'm at risk of coercion. So it's broader than that. So I think there is an element through us of self-disclosure, and we have a consumer portal that allows individuals to come on and register. And I mean, I'm not saying that everybody is comfortable with that route, but certainly the results we are seeing is people are using it in a considered way and communicating different aspects of their vulnerability. But we don't just rely on that, because I think we have to accept that the most vulnerable amongst us are probably those who are least likely to be in a position to disclose the fact that they're vulnerable, if they're very elderly, if they're disabled, if they're really struggling with mental health. So we have to go down other routes as well. I think data sharing is absolutely essential, which is what we would advocate all the way. And we'd also advocate not having multiple different routes to communicate that vulnerability, not having to tell 25 different organisations or 25 different channels that somebody is in a vulnerable situation, but also looking at power of attorney. If you have a power of attorney and you're acting on somebody else's behalf, we accept that. If there's court of protection order with local authorities or legal firms or money management companies, if somebody has an authority to act on somebody else's behalf, then we should be looking at those channels as well. If somebody's vulnerable and it's relevant to an insurer, then it's probably relevant to the mobile phone company, their local authority with council tax, their bank, and so on. So I think data sharing is the key.
Sure, absolutely. And obviously the premise of that the customers generally have to inform an organisation once of their vulnerability is really, really key there. And would of course take away the necessity to be doing that all the time. And I often think about how difficult the conversations are and the calls I've listened to them, and on recorded also as well as in person. The conversation around identifying vulnerability is a huge burden for an agent, and ultimately we're expecting people, often the youngest within an organisation, to be not only policy experts, technical experts, are able to navigate through the tens of screens that insurance firms have for these people. We're expecting them to also be delivering the best customer experience as well as delivering the best outcomes for vulnerable customers, and just finding ways to make that as easy as possible for the members of staff and our employees to actually have almost, I can guarantee that toughest day-to-day job within the organisation, where they're actually dealing with customers on a one-to-one basis. So we have to begin to think about making those interactions easier for them. It isn't just about training; it's about finding the right type of blended approach to identification and then how customers are actually treated afterwards. Simran, how does a system like Voice help identify vulnerability, particularly when a customer hasn't actually said anything explicitly about vulnerability?
Yeah, so when it's explicit, it's easy enough, right? If they mention, I'm an alcoholic, that can be picked up on. But if they mention something like, well, I can stop whenever I want, a telltale phrase, that can also be picked up on. There are also features like their tone, their sentiment, along with measuring silences or long pauses, which could be an indicator. But what I'll show you an example of an implicit phrase actually, and how that could be identified. If I share my screen, and just let me know when you can see that.
Yep. Okay, that's come up now. Hopefully the sound works at the same time. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay,
perfect. So yeah, this is what a call would look like through Voice. You can see here an alert's been raised, and
dyslexia, would that be a problem?
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So you can see there the customer has explicitly mentioned that they've got a vulnerability, and that's then been logged through the system, which is great. However, again, like I say, if something is mentioned implicitly, for example, on this call, where the customer has mentioned they've been in hospital recently, so explicitly stated that I'm a vulnerable customer, but actually this is something that the agent probably needs to pick up, and if they haven't picked up, no problem, because Voice has done that for them. So that's Voice helps identify these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Simran. So now on to, I suppose, moving from insight to action. So talking about, let's say, pathways, not paperwork. So Helen, once a firm's identified a potentially vulnerable customer, or indeed they've identified themselves and those records have been logged, what should happen next? What does good practice look like once that identification's happened?
Okay, I would reinforce absolutely what you've said in terms of staff who are, and call handlers who are managing those people. I just think we are asking an awful lot of those individuals. It's extremely stressful. You're asking them to understand a huge range of different vulnerabilities that I don't think any of us can be expected to do, and it's constant, and I think that support is absolutely essential. So give them the tools and the training to do that as far as possible, and give them the technology, if that's appropriate, to do it as much as possible. What I said earlier is you've got to determine how that individual circumstances are relevant to what you're doing with them, and we can get hung up on the word vulnerability. It's very broad, but what is somebody saying to you that changes the way you might want to communicate with them? And it's identifying that customer journey that is most important. And I think wherever we identify vulnerability, we should be giving somebody a stepping stone to help themselves. Now, whether that's the way we manage them or actually guiding them in the right direction, then you are providing that individual with support. And I think you can break it down. If it's if the primary issue is financial, somebody's struggling to meet their obligations in any way, if we understand what the situation is, we can adapt to the way we treat them. And it may be a short-term life event. Vulnerability can be very transient. Yeah. And if we know that, we can adapt it rather than putting somebody under a huge amount of pressure. It might simply be giving them an amount of breathing space. It could be that somebody has accessibility issues. They should only really have to tell you that once, and we adapt the way we communicate with them. And we can tailor communications that are sent out to meet people's needs, and there's lots of tools in place to allow us to do that. And I think just things like our expectations of people. I mean, I always sort of cite a recent example. I got an amendment to some council tax recently, and I had a letter from my local authority. I could not understand that letter for the life of me. I've spent my life in financial services and all the rest of it, and I'm thinking, we really have to adapt things to accept that we are dealing with very overwhelmed people with a lot of challenges, and bring things down a level and make sure our communication is right. And back to the repeated disclosures, let's not expect people to repeatedly tell us the same thing in a consistent way and be comfortable with that. And that is applicable to any sector. I think there are nuances that are sector specific about when vulnerability is relevant, but the fact that somebody is vulnerable is probably relevant to every sector, if you get my drift.
And I guess, is there anything sort of specifically around insurance worth drawing out there? So my mind would immediately go to the point of claim being a particular part in the standard customer journey when they have an insurance policy. If they need to claim, is that something that you would talk about specifically in insurance?
I would, and I think that in some ways the insurance sector is a little bit disadvantaged because you've got customers at arm's length, and customers probably don't want to speak necessarily. They just want to get on with it, renew, change, a switch or whatever. But when a claim comes to play, that might be the first time that that vulnerability is relevant. So to capture that up front, it makes that far more plain sailing. And I think also, we forget, when we're dealing with things day to day, somebody isn't making a claim very often, hopefully. And if they are, it's all new and they've got to bring all those things to bear. So to make that communication and that customer journey as tailored as possible is best for everybody.
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. So, Simran, we've promised everyone a case study, so it'd be great to move on to that now. So if you can walk us through how one of your clients has used Voice to move from identification into that tangible next step space.
Yeah, sure. So our customer, One Call Insurance, pretty well-known broker in Doncaster. They work across both personal and commercial lines, and they use Voice. One of the features they use Voice for is detecting vulnerable customers. So actually from October 2024 to March of this year, we alerted them to 4,767 cases in which vulnerability was present in a customer call, which is huge. From that, they were then able to provide that targeted agent coaching, which in turn increased their compliance scores, but also crucially allowed them to better serve their customers going forward, right? 90% of those they might probably would have missed out on if it weren't for Voice. Not only that, they actually mapped out those cases to potential complaints that they could have missed due to that, and the regulatory redress costs associated with those complaints. And that actually amounted to £23,000 in a year. Again, just massive numbers. So Voice allows for better trained staff, better outcomes for the customer, but ultimately better outcomes for the business too.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that just shows how important it is to have the right tools embedded with the organisation. If the good intentions aren't really good enough anymore, firms need structured systems, help guide in the best next step in real time to agents. So I'm going to move on here to where firms maybe tend to go wrong. So we're going to shift to, I suppose, what we might call common mistakes. Helen, where do you think firms are currently falling short?
I think the FCA have drawn this out a little bit in talking about embedding vulnerability management in a culture, and I think it's unusual to see cases where that is embedded yet. The things that I see going wrong and a lot and have done and they vary, but they're different organisations have different views, but the organisations some organisations still believe they don't have vulnerable customers. We've talked about the 50% figure. I think we all know in our heart of hearts that can't possibly be true. We still see a lot of excuses for not managing vulnerability, and that will include the old data protection. We can't share data, we can't do anything because we have to protect individuals' privacy. There are ways of processing data that are perfectly compliant and in the individual's interests. I don't think vulnerability is necessarily yet at a senior enough priority level necessarily as a priority on the board all the time. We have a lot of, most organisations have an element or resource within there that deals with vulnerability, but it can be very ring fence. It needs to be broader than that and carried through the organisation. And I think it's very wrong to be sitting there waiting for regulation to come in and the fines to start and the action to be taken, because that will only start to address specifics. It won't address the wider issue. It'll be certain things that are done wrong that might result in regulatory action. So, and I think that is the case. I think a lot of organisations are waiting for real specific prescribed actions to take, and when action will be taken against them. And I think, as we've already talked about, vulnerability is too broad. We're not going to get that prescriptive approach coming across to us.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And Simran, from your perspective, so obviously core monitoring, firms failing to act on red flag. What are the sort of common mistakes that you see organisations making?
Yeah, I mean, so most firms are only listening to around 1 to 2% of calls, and they're spending a huge amount of time doing so. And the reality is that makes it near impossible to ensure you're identifying and serving vulnerable customers the way that we need to. Even with things like feedback time, so we typically find it takes around 4 weeks from a call taking place until the feedback to the agent is given. Now, by that time, the agent has forgotten the call, they've forgotten that customer, and they're unable to be effectively trained and change their behaviours to, again, making sure that they're providing customers with the best outcomes possible. Through voice, we can reduce that to under 24 hours. Our customer assist insurance, they're a great example of this. The time that it used to take them to actually provide that feedback to what we've reduced that to is from 16 hours to under 40 minutes, which is brilliant, and equally within that 4-week time frame, if they've not provided that agent with the relevant coaching, then that customer might call back tomorrow. And that vulnerability's not been logged, and now what do? That escalates further. So it's really crucial to be able to provide that feedback instantly as well.
Excellent. And I think a often forgotten possibility, and obviously we've spoken very much in the transactional day-to-day of interaction with customers, but of course getting these things wrong can, from a higher level, lead to sort of severe reputational brand damage, even regulatory action. So it's obviously a priority to ensure that customers are getting the best outcomes, which are suitable to their vulnerability, but also that there are issues much bigger than that the exec, for example, need to be considering, but don't always make it onto the table as far as the conversations around vulnerability in those forums go. Just a quick reminder, we've had a few questions come in already that I can see. Spencer, I promise we'll get to those at the end and do our very best to answer them. But yeah, just to move on. So we've spoken, I suppose, as much as anything around what bad looks like. So let's move on to what a good looks like. So Helen, from your perspective, what would you cite as a best case scenario when it comes to dealing with vulnerability?
I think it's just the reverse of really what we said. It's where vulnerability is embedded in an organisation and doing it for the right reason rather than doing it. You can, of course, there are negatives about getting it wrong. There's the reputational side of it. There's the regulatory side of it. There's all that. But we need to start to look at the benefits of getting it right. We need. Who would not want to? Would not prefer to work with an organisation that treated and was able to say they treated vulnerable individuals in the right way. Look at the cost benefits. Treating vulnerable customers well is never going to be a big revenue spinner, but it is going to be a big cost saving if you get it right, and you don't have to have 10 conversations about the same thing. We're not at a stage yet where we've got much more than anecdotal evidence of that, and Simran might be able to come up with some brilliant stats around that, but I don't think we're actually looking at that sufficiently and saying, how is this going to save us money and time, not just for the firm, but for the individual as well. We talked about trained staff. Don't have such too high an expectation, and don't let the bug sit with those customer customer facing staff, because that expectation is too high. Nobody has the life experience, however old, to be able to deal with every aspect of vulnerability. But if we can help them in terms of empathy, putting themselves in other people's shoes, having that sort of recognition of the human side of things. I think the FCA have actually been quite clear in their guidance recently around staff training, around call monitoring, around monitoring the outcomes of dealing with vulnerable customers effectively. The fact that, you know, vulnerability management doesn't sort of hit at one point, it is through the whole customer journey, and it needs to be acknowledged throughout that customer journey. And also, I think, you know, it's really investing in it, you know, and investing the time to look at customer journeys, not just giving lip service to treating vulnerable customers in the right way. And that's, to me, what good looks like. And data sharing.
And data sharing. So you touched on something there, Helen, that I often think about when it comes to vulnerability. Is a lot of organisations effectively think we can flag them, we do training, and that's almost viewed as a, I suppose, acceptable approach to vulnerability. What would your commentary be on that? Would you agree with that, or and do you think that sometimes training is relied on too heavily when it comes to vulnerability as being the solution for all organisations?
It depends how it's done. If it's just a box ticking exercise, and it depends on the people. Again, I'd come back to, we can't just put a corporate sort of handle on dealing with vulnerability. You are talking about people's emotions. You're talking about how people get up in the morning and feel differently when they go to bed at night. So there has to be that empathy. I think there's a lot in terms of, a lot of call handling staff are typically, and I don't wish to stereotype here, but very often younger, and you're expecting them to have that vast life experience and that. So you've got to equip them in a way, but it's not just about training. We can't just train a load of staff and leave them and let them run off. It has to be backed up, and you have to show them and give them tools to be able to lead vulnerable customers in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So Simran, obviously we've had a little bit of a look at the voice platform, how it uses calls to help identify vulnerability. Does it sort of have much else? So what is there around, like, using data, for example, from the platform, or anything else that the platform might deliver that's really helpful to organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. Various reports through voice. I mean, by monitoring 100% of all calls, you can only imagine the amount of data that you get from those customer calls. And again, we've mentioned agent training, but it really is crucial in, you know, not just on the vulnerable customer side and identifying them. It's providing that support and care and empathy afterwards, right? I mean, through voice, I think it was with One Call Insurance, we helped increase their compliance scores by 11%. Now, by doing that, more compliant calls means, you know, customers are better looked after, and that's increased retention rates. With one of our customers, we helped increase their sales conversions by 10.82%. So it's by providing that agent coaching, not just on the vulnerabilities, it's what comes after that as well, and providing those customers with the care that they need, so they'll come back again, right? I mean, with that data, they can strategically plan for the future as a business. They can make more data-driven decisions. Again, listening to 1 to 2% of calls, it's very, very difficult for a firm to be able to plan based on that. Firms are now building their products with vulnerable customers in mind, and the best outcomes in mind as well. So, yeah.
And one project I was working on with a loan organisation, when they examined the data they're getting back through vulnerability assessments, they also identified through their rejections reviews that they were rejecting people for applications for loans that they actually didn't really need to, but based on the data they were seeing back from their vulnerability surveying. So they were able to open up a new product for people with in particular circumstances. So again, a sort of commercial avenue to identifying vulnerability. And ultimately, if you're building up an environment where your customers trust you more, then they'll buy more, stay longer, and refer others. And that's the holy grail for an insurance organisation. Obviously, when it comes to the customer experience and the outcomes that they're delivering to customers, whether they're vulnerable or not. So unless there's anything else from either of you, we're going to move into audience Q&A. I know Spencer fairly well, and I'm not surprised he's got a few questions to ask. So we'll go through them one by one if that's possible, and see where we get to. Spencer, if there's anything we don't answer for you today, then I'll speak to Simran and Helen, and we'll come back to you on an individual basis. But first question there, I'll read it out, and if we can bring it up as well, that'd be great. Did you know, I think probably Helen, this one for you, that relying on third parties to communicate with banks and customer services can be problematic, especially when considering GDPR rules preventing those parties from sharing their identity, create serious vulnerabilities for the 15 million people in the UK living with hearing loss. Helen, is that something you've sort of come across with or can comment for?
So as I say, data protection can be a great barrier to us moving forward on that, and we can say we can't do this for data protection reasons. So you can share data around vulnerability. You obviously have to work within the guidelines. You have to protect individuals' privacy. So a lot of our data is predicated on consent. So an individual is essentially, in brief, consenting to share the data, and we hold as minimal data as we can to do the job, as you should, and people will consent very clearly to what's going to happen with that data. Other organisations have the authority to act on somebody else's behalf. I cited the example of a power of attorney, so we would validate that power of attorney, court of protection orders, that side of things. Mm-hmm. And then organisations can share information with other organisations based on working with the customer and gaining that customer's consent with them. So if I'm your bank, I'm talking to you, I can obtain consent. But there are other ways of data sharing if appropriate, and there are legitimate interest arguments, substantive interest arguments for doing so. Just to give me some credibility on that, I mean, we've always considered data protection as a very important issue when we've been building the database. I've got a data protection background, and we have talked to the ICO about what we're doing. I would like to see more clarity, actually, around what organisations can and can't do, more specifics, because I think organisations understandably struggle and they are frightened of getting it wrong, and I get that.
Sure, and it's one of those issues where I think potentially we should be looking for the perfect solution. It's really about bringing practices on bit by bit and improving those within organisations. It's such a sensitive area, of course. Data sharing is a fantastic concept, but of course it will bring issues along as well. So in the second question, Spencer, I think we've already touched on this somewhat. So I suppose a main point from Spencer there being sort of data sharing alone won't be enough. We've spoken about training, maybe left field or different practices that either of you have seen that.
I mean, there are different solutions, and I think the whole vulnerability problem needs to be dealt with in a collaborative way. And everything I ever say, organisations need to collaborate on this and work together. So no data sharing. There is no perfect solution to this. There never will be. We're never going to capture everybody who's vulnerable and get it 100% right, but there are different solutions that can come together, I think, to work. I don't know if Simran's got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. It is a tricky one, and it's difficult, but I'm sure in the future, I mean, I'd hope there are guidelines that are going to be set out about this kind of thing to allow just to provide clarity, I guess, on what's best.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, Simran, I hope you've read this one and you're ready for it. Spencer asks, you've shown us a portal for all calls. Did you send a copy of the call to the vulnerable customers? Doesn't feel right companies keep all customers' calls, and that's just jumped on, while vulnerability customers don't get a copy. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so I mean, as a third party at Voice, it'd be, I'm sure there's probably legal issues surrounding us sending calls to customers, but I definitely think, Spencer, that again, this is potentially something in the future that maybe insurance companies, as an example, might want to implement within their phone calls. By the way, if we've identified a vulnerability, do you want us to send the call over to you? That's potentially something that insurance companies could implement. As a third party, like I say, it's not something that we would really get involved in. But yeah, very, very interesting thought.
And so Spencer, we'll come back to your last question as well. But we've got one from Kelly, which says, given the FCA receives all of the annual board reports, it would be good if they would share best practice back to the industry as part of their feedback. Is this something that could be facilitated? I might argue, Helen, I'll be interested in your take on this. There is, I might say, enough guidance out there around best practice as things stand. It's just digging in, finding it, and working out exactly how it applies to your particular organisation and subsector.
The thing with regulation of any type is it won't tell you exactly what to do. And I mentioned the sort of, I've got a bit of a history working with data protection. There's a lot of words like reasonable and that side of things. It's never, you will do this in this circumstance. And I think because vulnerability is so broad, but I would say the FCA have huge focus on this, and I think they do listen. So if they get enough feedback saying they need things, they will probably respond to it in some way.
Yeah, agree. Kelly, I can see you've followed up as well, but I think I relayed exactly what you were asking there. And so another one from Spencer, the lack of vulnerability awareness training in the workplace is a big challenge we face today. Can this lead to issues with customers? I'm wondering if HR should conduct thorough vulnerability training for all contact centre recruits. I can only agree wholeheartedly with that, and would say that does happen in a lot of organisations, but also in some organisations doesn't happen. But would that be Simran, what you witnessed?
Yeah, I mean, my first job was at a call centre about 10 years ago at a known insurance broker. I was 18. I had no experience of, vulnerabilities, or I was just on the phone. I was speaking with people who were vulnerable. A lot of people that were in financial detriment, missing payments, and that kind of thing. And I didn't have the appropriate training that I would have needed, specifically at that age, to understand what these people were going through, as I would now, obviously being adult. So yeah, I definitely think that this training should be provided, especially, as we say, to junior staff who don't have an understanding of these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And anything else to add on that one, Helen?
I'm just smiling. When I was 18, I don't think in a call centre anybody cared whether anybody else was vulnerable or not. I used to deal with people with credit report issues. I worked for Credit Reference Agency, and it was like, well, you owe some money, sort it out. I would say HR induction training at the very, very least. It needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be reinforced all the way through the process, I would say.
Yeah, and I think a general climate of care through an organisation, which invariably will come from the top of the organisation, is only going to be healthy as well. Looking out for customers' best interest, whether they're vulnerable or not, really needs to be the default approach when it comes to the customer experience and the outcomes being offered. Right, so I can see another question having come through from Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. Some vulnerabilities are transient. We rightly focus on logging these and taking appropriate action to support customers. There's less discussion around identifying when a vulnerability is no longer relevant and how the customer journey should adapt in response. Helen, does your database update accordingly to reflect these changes?
Hi, yeah, Michelle, it does. So we have, first and foremost, a consumer portal, and that consumer portal allows individuals to go in, register themselves, and to say the types of vulnerability and what support they need. It also allows them to manage that and change it at any time. So they can go in and delete themselves. They can we've got a range of about 34 vulnerability flags. They can add flags or take flags off or change what support they need. That portal also leads them to help, things like benefits calculators, a range of support, the National Support Network giving them loads of options around how they can support themselves. So when somebody self-registers, yes, but we also regularly contact individuals to say, you do know you're still on here, don't you? You do wish to still be on here. Do you want your data deleted, or do you want to update it? And similarly, if an organisation shares data with us, they will update the data on a regular basis too.
Thank you, Helen. And Spencer, I think you're pushing against an open door on this one. I often hear people say in the future that we are already moving forward so quickly, it feels like AI is everywhere we look. If you keep it on hold, there'll be more issues, especially with an ageing population in the UK. Absolutely, Spencer. I have seen and interacted with a few different AI solutions and indeed more manual solutions when it comes to vulnerability identification and treatment. I just couldn't agree more to be relying on agents still to pick these things up and work out the best thing to do for customers. It is quite antiquated. Helen, Simran, anything to add on that?
Well, Simran, I'll let you go.
I'd agree. Yeah. I think it's one for their guidelines are what they mandate, and I think they do need to start mandating certain kind of policies and procedures, because with leaving things so open-ended and it's very subjective and open to interpretation, they need to start mandating certain processes, and then everyone can follow accordingly.
And I think just what I said earlier about the most vulnerable amongst us are probably the ones that are least likely to be in a position to voice that, and we push people down digital channels. I think AI is in some ways an answer to that. You're not reliant on the individual actually going in all the time and doing things themselves.
Absolutely. Okay, excellent stuff. So unless there are any more questions, and I can't see any coming through at the moment, I'll keep an eye on those just for the next couple of minutes, but I'll begin to wrap up. So brings us to the end of today's session. Obviously a huge thank you to Helen and Simran for sharing expertise, and to everyone else for joining us. Really enjoyed the questions and answers as well. Really good to see the interaction following the presentation. So just before we go, if you're not a member of the Protect Association LinkedIn group yet, then please do join us there. And if you're interested in becoming a full member, then feel free to reach out to me directly. And look out for details of the next session, which we'll be announcing shortly. So Simran and Helen, thanks again for your time. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.